I'm Brent Jensen, and welcome to episode 3, the 1970s, of The Sound of a Dry Martini, Remembering Paul Desmond. This is made possible by the Manieri Jazz and Swing Endowment. That piece you just heard was probably from one of the first albums I heard of Paul Desmond's. It's a tune entitled Just Squeeze Me by Duke Ellington. It features Jamie Findley on guitar, Chris Seimer on bass, and John Bishop on drums. And during the 1970s, Paul kind of comes out of his hibernation after the disbandment of the Dave Brubeck Quartet in '67. He takes about a three or 4 year period of where he's just kind of hanging out in his apartment, not really playing that much. He liked to hang out at a place called Elaine's, which all of the writers from the New York area would kind of hang out in. And then he started to realize that all of these writers had these fantasies about being jazz musicians, and he was going, wait a minute, I am a jazz musician. These guys that I want to emulate all want to be me. Maybe I should go back to doing what I do well. So as we mentioned in the episode 2, he did have the one article that was published in Punch magazine, but other than that, the only examples of his writing style are really of his liner notes. But you can also see, if you get the Doug Ramsey biography, there's a lot of his letters that he was writing back and forth with his father most often, and a lot of his wit and wordplay. I mean, he was a pretty sharp guy and very interesting to kind of hang around, listen to him speak, and also watch, see what he has written. So Just Squeeze Me was from an album called Pure Desmond, which was released in 1974, so that would be right around the time I started listening to jazz kind of seriously. I was 14, 15 years old or so. And there's an album called, a label called CTI, Creed Taylor, who was a producer, Creed Taylor Industries, I believe, was CTI, and had a lot of those CTI albums during that particular period. He would also continue his association with the guitarist Jim Hall. And so there was an album called Concerto, which featured both Jim Hall and Chet Baker, the trumpet player Chet Baker, who he had played with some earlier. Some of his later recordings in the 1970s are associated with Chet Baker. They're under Chet Baker's name. Chet Baker was the leader and he was the sideman. So he did quite a bit of work for CTI. You can find him on several different albums. The arranger who did a lot of arranging for CTI, Don Sebesky, had an album called Giant Box. I think it was a 3 LP set, and features Desmond on a couple tunes specifically and through there. So those are all kind of in the mid-70s or so, 74, 75. There's actually online a radio show which they have saved. It's from a show called Night Lights. It's from Indiana Public Media. So the link is indianapublicmedia.org. If you go to that website, you could just type into they have a search engine, just enter Paul Desmond, and it'll come up right away. And it's specifically a show of, it's called After Brubeck, Paul Desmond in the 1970s. It's talking about this period of time when he sort of starts to emerge as a leader, which he did kind of reluctantly. He didn't really want to be the leader of a group. Dave Brubeck was more suited for that, like talking to the audience and kind of, being a showman and so forth. And Paul liked to just kind of sit in the corner by the piano with his arms folded over his alto, play his solo, and kind of be done, and wouldn't really speak very much in the performances with the Dave Brubeck Quartet. But Night Lights talks about this particular period, the recordings that he's doing. There's also one from NPR. If you just go to npr.org/jazz profiles, there's a series, a radio show featuring Nancy Wilson. Vocalist Nancy Wilson is the narrator. And there was one on Paul called The Sound of a Dry Martini, just like our series here. Right? So once again, they use that a lot, which Paul got a little tired of. But he was going for The Sound of a Dry Martini. And so The Sound of a Dry Martini episode is kind of an overview of Paul Desmond's whole entire life. It's about an hour-long radio show. And several other really good radio shows in there too. I think Jerry Mulligan is featured on one of them, and Dave Brubeck and a couple other people. But the one on Paul has a lot of the same information that you can kind of get from the Doug Ramsey book as well, kind of overview of his career. For me, one of my favorite groups of his was sometimes referred to as the Canadian Quartet. He had played a lot with Jim Hall, but there was a gig he took in Toronto where Jim Hall was unable to travel to Toronto to join him to play at this club called Bourbon Street. And so he recommended Jim Hall recommended a guitarist he knew of in Canada named Ed Bickert. And Ed Bickert becomes an associate of Paul Desmond's he's on the Pure Desmond album. That's kind of his debut in the United States. And then Paul continued to do quite a bit of performing in Canada, mostly at this club, Bourbon Street in Toronto. Fortunately, the bass player, also Canadian, the whole group is Canadian, Don Thompson, who plays a number of different instruments, bass, piano. He played bass with George Shearing for several years, is also a very talented piano player, also a great vibraphone player. But he was playing bass, and he had a portable, I think it was probably a reel-to-reel recorder, and he recorded everything that they did. And just recently, just in this past year, he took it to Mosaic Records, and Mosaic released a box set of all of the recordings that he did. They digitally enhanced the sound. The sound is quite a bit better than there have been some bootlegs over the years that have come from these recordings, which the sound was less than stellar. And the sound is great on this. It's a 7 CD collection. It might be available on LP as well. I bought the CD collection. So here you see the picture of the box set of it's the complete Toronto recordings of Paul Desmond and his Canadian Quartet. So it was in the early mid-70s or so, 1974 to 76 maybe. And there is a very interesting, this just came to light recently. I mentioned in episode 2 a guy named Steve Serra. He's a drummer, C-E-R-R-A, and he has a jazzhistoryonline.com. Oh, actually, this is actually the Tom Cunliffe. It's not Steve Serra. Steve Serra was one that I mentioned on episode 2. This one is jazzhistoryonline.com, and Thomas Cunniff, C-U-N-N-I-F-F-E, I believe is how it's spelled. And he's done several different articles, and one of them is just called Paul Desmond and the Canadians. It talks about this release. The most interesting thing about that particular entry that Thomas puts in there is he has embedded in the article a 30-minute video from a Canadian show called Take 30. Ironically, since we were talking about Take 5, this was no connection. They had a 30-minute show that they did. You'll see 2 interviewers that are on there that they open with. But it's this group, it's this Canadian group, while they were in Toronto. And so it opens with them performing. They do a brief interview. The only thing I'd ever seen before anywhere online, on YouTube or anything, was the 10-minute interview that they did with Paul, which was interesting in itself, but they talk about the pieces he's going to play, and I always would ask myself, where's that? I want to see the footage of that. And Thomas Cunniff, who has this jazzhistoryonline.com website, was able to get permission from the people that must be the Canadian Broadcasting Company or something, that had this to post that in his blog. So if you scroll down through it, they talk about his relationship with Don Thompson, and Jerry Fuller was the drummer, Ed Bickert, the guitarist we mentioned before. Right toward the bottom, there's a little click with the YouTube icon. You click on that. You won't find it on YouTube. You can't find it. You can only find the 10-minute interview that he does. There's the entire show. And you get to see him performing a couple of different tunes. On that one, he performs a tune in the beginning, in the middle, and the end. I think there's at least 3, maybe 4 performances, and then a little bit of the interview too. So that's definitely worth seeking out. His particular website, he only has not a whole lot of entries, so usually the Paul Desmond one, but he has a search engine also, so you can just type in Paul Desmond, and that one will come right up. I think he's maybe done 2 different articles on Paul Desmond on that one. So again, that's Thomas Cunniff, not Steve Serra, as I mentioned earlier, jazzhistoryonline.com. His final recordings that he makes, Paul succumbs to lung cancer. He's diagnosed, I think, probably in 75 or 76 as having lung cancer, which surprised him because as much as he loved to drink Dewar's, he always thought it would be liver that would be he would succumb to, but it was not. He was a heavy smoker and died in May of 1977. And his final recordings were done just shortly, maybe a month or two. I think it was March of 1977. He did a recording with Chet Baker, a tune called You Can't Go Home Again. It's on the album You Can't Go Home Again under Chet Baker's name. And that's based on a Rachmaninoff, I think it's second concerto. It's one of the movements of that, which has been used in a lot of pop music. You would probably recognize it once you hear it. But he was very weak during that particular recording session. He did a couple, I think he had Autumn Leaves or a couple other tunes. But he said at one point, that's all I got. You know, he had basically pulled himself out of his deathbed in his apartment to come and play a couple tunes and went back. And right around that same time, his very last recording, the officially last recording, is on an Art Garfunkel album, and it's a tune called Mr. Shuck and Jive. Features just a brief little alto saxophone solo. It's kind of like Phil Woods' alto saxophone solo on Billy Joel's Just the Way You Are. And just a little brief one kind of towards the end as the tune's fading out. Those are his last recordings. Upon the time of his death, there's kind of an interesting story that's been told a couple different times. He didn't have really any close family by that time. His mother and father had both passed away. He didn't have any siblings. And so his lawyer, as he was kind of preparing his will, his living will, said, you know, you're getting a pretty good chunk of royalties from Take Five. You're continuing to receive royalties from the songs that you've written and the recordings, and you should find somebody to, you know, leave your estate to and this money that's coming in too. And he just mentioned to his lawyer, well, you know, I can't think of anybody. The Red Cross is a great institution. Why don't we leave it, put the Red Cross in there? And he said, okay, but you know, if you think of somebody, you know, I'll change it. But he passed away before that happened. And I remember reading somewhere, I think this is probably a conservative estimate, but a couple years ago, the Red Cross has taken in somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 million from Paul Desmond's royalties. They were all going to the Red Cross. And in the Red Cross's institution, which Washington, D.C., I'm not sure where they're located, but in their main headquarters, there is a Paul Desmond, fittingly, Paul Desmond boardroom, meeting room, because he has contributed handily to the efforts of the Red Cross. There's also a little story about this last song that we're going to kind of finish up with, is probably next to Take Five, one of his best known compositions. It's based on the chord changes of a song called For All We Know, which is an old standard. And he used to call with his Canadian group. He would call this and he'd say, For All We Know in E flat. And they'd start playing the chords, and he would never play the melody of For All We Know. He would play this alternate melody. And the alternate melody underwent several different title revisions. Paul was a kind of a legendary ladies' man, always had many different women, Gloria Steinem among them, who he had dated. A lot of the models, if you look at the album covers throughout the 60s with Jim Hall, most of those models he had dated at some point. But he had called it by different women's names, not surprisingly. And in fact, in the interview on the show I mentioned earlier, the Canadian show, they asked him something about, he plays this tune, which came to be known as Wendy. And the interviewer says, well, you know, I didn't know what to name it. What about, you know, Joanne or, you know, Nicole or something like that. For a period of time, he actually called it Pittsburgh, which is not the greatest name for this kind of ballad-like song. And it became a joke within the musicians that, you know, what do you call that tune? What do you call it? And he had a couple different women's names, and then he just started calling it Pittsburgh. And there was a young lady, actually quite a bit younger than himself, who he had started dating, who was named Wendy. And they were at a cocktail party or a gig or something, and this beautiful young woman comes up, and Paul goes to introduce her to one of the musicians, and the musician says, "Oh, you must be Pittsburgh." So that's the point where he tips his hand. Oh, yes, that's Wendy, and so the tune becomes known as Wendy, and that's the tune we're going to finish with. Wendy by Paul Desmond, and this will feature Steve Tate on percussion and Jamie Finley on guitar and myself on alto saxophone.